In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets whisper through the hedgerows, Miss Jane Marple's keen mind is drawn into a chilling mystery when a stolen artifact, a map rumoured to lead to a cursed treasure, surfaces. Miss Marple finds herself entangled in a web of deception, greed and hidden truths. With her unparalleled understanding of human nature, she must unravel the secrets of the map to death before its dark legacy claims another victim. Chapter 1. The Whisper of St. Mary Mead. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, painting the thatched roofs and rose gardens in hues of amber. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The village was quiet, as it often was, save for the occasional chatter of sparrows or the distant hum of a bicycle on the lane. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes, peering over her spectacles, sensed a disturbance in the air, a ripple of something amiss, like a shadow passing over a still pond. She had just set her knitting aside to pour a cup of tea when a knock came at the door. It was not the gentle tap of her neighbour, Mrs. Price, nor the eager rap of her nephew, Raymond. This was a hesitant, almost reluctant knock, as if the visitor were unsure of their welcome. Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, adjusted her shawl, and called, "Come in." The door creaked open, revealing a young man in a tweed jacket, his face flushed and his hat clutched tightly in his hands. He was no older than 30. With a nervous energy that reminded Miss Marple of a certain young man from her youth, a poet who had been rather too fond of dramatics. "Miss Marple? Miss Jane Marple?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "The very same," she replied, her tone warm but measured. "And you are Edwin Turner, ma'am? I was told you're the person to see about delicate matters." He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be lurking in the rose bushes. Miss Marple gestured to a chair. "Do sit down, Mr. Turner. Tea?" He shook his head, perching on the edge of the seat like a bird ready to take flight. "No, thank you. I stirred, come about something urgent. It says about a map, a very old, very dangerous map." Miss Marple Sid's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "A map, you say? Maps are such curious things, aren't they? They promise direction, but can lead one terribly astray." Edwin swallowed, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. "This one sits different, Miss Marple. It sits called The Map to Death. It was stolen from my employer, Lord Ashford, 2 weeks ago. He sits beside himself. And, well, there are whispers, it sits cursed." "Cursed?" Miss Marple's voice held just the right note of curiosity, encouraging him to continue. She had heard of curses before. Village gossip was full of them, but she knew better than to dismiss such talk outright. Superstition often cloaked truth in a more palatable guise. Edwin leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The map is said to lead to a treasure hidden centuries ago by a reclusive nobleman, Sir Reginald Blackwood, but everyone who's ever followed it has met a grim end, accidents, disappearances. Worse, Lord Ashford kept it locked away in his study, but someone broke in and took it. He's convinced it's tied to a gathering he's hosting this weekend at Ashford Hall. He asked me to find someone discreet to investigate." "And you thought of me," Miss Marple said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "How flattering. But tell me, Mr. Turner, why does Lord Ashford not go to the police?" Edwin Sept's face darkened. "He doesn't trust them. Too many prying eyes, he says. And the guests, they Septs are important people, politicians, scholars, Even a foreign diplomat, he can set afford a scandal." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the possibilities. A stolen map, a grand gathering, a lord with secrets. Oh, it was all too familiar, like a pattern in her knitting, each stitch leading to the next. "And this map," she said, "do you know what it looks like?" Edwin hesitated, then reached into his pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "This is a sketch I made from memory. It's stews, parchment, brittle, with strange symbols, almost like a code. Lord Ashford showed it to me once, before it was stolen." Miss Marple took the sketch, her fingers brushing the paper as she studied it. The lines were crude, but she could make out a labyrinthine design, dotted with symbols that seemed both ancient and deliberate. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious indeed." Edwin shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Marple, will you come to Ashford Hall? The gathering is in 2 days. Lord Ashford will cover all expenses, and I think you sit the only one who can help." She set the sketch down and looked at him, her eyes sharp despite their gentle appearance. "I shall need to know more about these guests, Mr. Turner. People, you see, are far more telling than maps. They wear their secrets like ill-fitting coats, and I've always been rather good at noticing the seams." Edwin managed a weak smile. "I still tell you everything I know on the way. Please say you still come." Miss Marple considered, her gaze drifting to the window where the sun was sinking behind the church spire. St. Mary Mead was her haven, but the world beyond had a way of calling her when mysteries stirred. "Very well," she said at last. "I shall pack my bag. But do be prepared, Mr. Turner. Mysteries have a way of unraveling in unexpected ways." As Edwin thanked her profusely and hurried out, Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her mind already weaving a tapestry of possibilities. A stolen map, a cursed legend, a house full of strangers. Oh, this would be a puzzle worth solving. Dear listeners, where are you following this mystery from? London, Lahore, or perhaps a cozy village like St. Mary Mead? Drop your location below and subscribe to our channel for the next chapter of this thrilling tale. Don't miss a single clue. Join us as we unravel the secrets together. Chapter 2. The Curious Invitation. The train to Ashford Hall chugged through the English countryside, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Miss Jane Marple's thoughts. She sat by the window, her knitting resting in her lap, her eyes tracing the rolling hills that blurred past in shades of green and gold. Edwin Turner sat opposite, fidgeting with his cufflinks, his earlier nervousness now tempered by a restless energy. Miss Marple noted it with interest. Young men, she had observed, often betrayed their secrets in such small gestures. "Tell me more about these guests, Mr. Turner," she said, her voice gentle but probing, like a needle threading through fabric. "One can learn so much from a guest list. Don't that you think? It sets rather like a village fete. Everyone brings their own peculiarities." Edwin glanced at her, then out the window, as if the hedgerows might overhear. "Lord Ashford's gatherings are always eclectic," he began. "This one's no different. There's Lady Beatrice Worthing, a widow with a sharp tongue and sharper ambitions. She's been after Ashford's collection of artifacts for years. Then there's Professor Clarence Dodd, a historian obsessed with medieval maps. He's brilliant, but dreadfully pompous." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Pompous men often hide their insecurities behind big words, Mr. Turner. Go on." Edwin nodded. "There's also Miss Clara Duval, a French art dealer. She's charming, but I don't trust her smiles. They're too perfect. And Sir Victor Crane, a retired diplomat. He's polite, but there's something cold about him. Oh, and Mr. Harold Blake, a businessman who's been trying to buy land from Lord Ashford. He's loud, always talking about profits." "Quite a gathering," Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking softly. "And Lord Ashford himself? What sort of man is he?" Edwin hesitated, choosing his words with care. "He sits generous but private, loves his artifacts, maps, especially the map to death, was his pride and joy. He sits been different since it was stolen, though. Paranoid. Almost." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Paranoia, she knew, often stemmed from knowledge of something worth fearing. "And the invitation," she prompted. "How did it come about?" Edwin reached into his jacket and produced a cream-colored envelope, its wax seal broken but still bearing the Ashford crest, a raven clutching a scroll. "This arrived yesterday at my lodging. Lord Ashford sent one to each guest, inviting them to discuss a matter of historical significance. I think he wants to flush out the thief." Miss Marple took the envelope, her fingers tracing the elegant script. The invitation was brief but deliberate, requesting the guests' presence for a weekend at Ashford Hall to view a unique acquisition. No mention of the stolen map, but the implication was clear. "A baited hook," she murmured. "How very clever of Lord Ashford, and how very dangerous." The train slowed as it approached Ashford Station, and soon Miss Marple and Edwin were in a chauffeured car, winding through narrow lanes toward the estate. Ashford Hall loomed into view, a sprawling manor of grey stone, its towers half shrouded in mist. Ivy clung to its walls, and the windows glinted like watchful eyes. Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of anticipation. Grand houses, like villages, held their secrets close. They were ushered into the grand hall, where a chandelier cast flickering light over oak panelling and a massive fireplace. Lord Ashford, a tall man with silver hair and a strange smile, greeted them. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "I trust you'll find our little gathering illuminating." "I'm sure I shall," she replied, her eyes scanning the room. The other guests were already assembling, their voices a low hum of polite tension. Lady Beatrice Worthing stood by the fireplace, her black dress severe, her gaze sharp as she surveyed the others. Professor Dodd, bespectacled and clutching a leather notebook, was lecturing Miss Duval, who smiled with practiced charm. Sir Victor Crane stood apart, his posture rigid, while Mr. Blake's booming laugh echoed from a corner. "Dinner will be served shortly," Lord Ashford announced. "But first, a small matter. Steph invited you all to view a rare artifact, a map of great historical value. Its theft's no longer in my possession, but I believe one of you knows its whereabouts." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. Professor Dodd adjusted his glasses, muttering about irresponsible stewardship. Miss Duval's smile faltered, and Sir Victor's eyes narrowed. Mr. Blake, however, laughed. "A treasure hunt, Ashford? You always did love your games." Miss Marple watched them all, her expression serene but her mind alert. People, she thought, were so very predictable in their unpredictability. A stolen map, a room full of suspects, each with their own motives, their own masks. She noted the way Lady Beatrice's fingers clutched her fan, the way Professor Dodd's eyes darted to the door, the way Miss Duval's charm seemed to flicker like a candle in a draught. As they moved toward the dining room, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze falling on a portrait above the fireplace, a stern-faced man in Elizabethan attire, his hand resting on a globe. The globe bore faint markings, not unlike those on Edwin's sketch of the map. "Curious," she murmured to herself, tucking the observation away. At dinner, the conversation was polite but strained, like a violin strung too tightly. Lord Ashford spoke of his collection, Professor Dodd waxed poetic about cartography, and Mr. Blake boasted of his latest venture. Miss Marple listened, saying little, her eyes moving from face to face. She noticed how Sir Victor avoided questions about his travels, how Miss Duval deflected inquiries with laughter, how Lady Beatrice's remarks carried a barb of resentment toward Lord Ashford. As the meal ended, Lord Ashford raised his glass. "To history," he said, his voice heavy with meaning, "and to those who seek its truths, whatever the cost." Miss Marple sipped her wine, her thoughts racing. The invitation was no mere formality. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down to a thief who sat among them. The map to death, she sensed, was more than a relic. It was a key to something deeper, something worth stealing for. And as she watched the guests disperse into the shadowed halls of Ashford Hall, she knew the game had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Map Sept's Dark Legend. The morning after the dinner at Ashford Hall dawned grey and heavy, the sky pressing low over the estate like a lid on a simmering pot. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, a cosy yet cavernous room lined with leather-bound tomes and maps, framed in gilt. Her knitting lay untouched on the table beside her, for her attention was fixed on a small leather notebook she had borrowed from Lord Ashford's collection, a record of his artifacts, including notes on the map to death. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls, but Miss Marple's mind was far from distracted. She had always found that history, like gossip, revealed its truths in the quiet spaces between words. Hall. Industry. All. Lord Ashford entered, his face lined with the strain of a sleepless night. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I trust you slept well." "Well enough, thank you," she replied, her tone mild, but her eyes sharp. "Though I find old houses like this one have a way of keeping one awake. Don situ. All those creaks and whispers, as if the walls themselves have stories to tell." He gave a tight smile, settling into a chair opposite her. "This house has too many stories. I sit, I'm afraid. You've been reading about the map. I see." Miss Marple closed the notebook gently, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. "Indeed, it sits a fascinating tale, Lord Ashford. But I sit'd rather hear it from you. Written words can be so impersonal. Tell me about this map to death." Lord Ashford leaned back, his gaze drifting to the fire. "It's an old story, older than this house. The map was created in the 16th century by Sir Reginald Blackwood, a nobleman with a passion for exploration and a reputation for ruthlessness. He was said to have discovered a treasure, not of gold or jewels, but of knowledge, secrets so dangerous they could ruin empires. He hid them somewhere in England, marking the location on a parchment inscribed with symbols only he understood. Miss Marple sipped's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A treasure of knowledge? How intriguing! And the curse?" Lord Ashford's expression darkened. "Every soul who sought the map has met misfortune. Sir Reginald himself vanished a year after creating it. In the 18th century, a scholar named Thomas Hale claimed to have deciphered it. He drowned in a river the next day. A century later, a collector, Lady Eleanor Voss, owned it briefly. Her house burned down, and the map was thought lost until my grandfather found it in an auction. Since then, it's been locked away until it was stolen 2 weeks ago." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. "And you believe one of your guests knows where it is? Why invite them, knowing the risk?" Lord Ashford hesitated, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "Because I am certain the thief is among them. The map was taken from a locked safe, and only someone with intimate knowledge of this house could have done it. I invited them to see who flinches, who betrays themselves." "A bold strategy," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but laced with admiration. "But people are rarely so forthcoming, Lord Ashford. They hide their guilt behind smiles and polite words, much like my neighbour Mrs. Price hides her gossip behind cups of tea." He chuckled, though it was a strange sound. "You see through people, don't you, Miss Marple?" "I merely observe," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "Now, tell me, what do these symbols on the map signify?" Mr. Turner's sixth sketch was rather vague. Lord Ashford rose and crossed to a bookshelf, pulling down a heavy volume on medieval cartography. "The symbols are a cipher, possibly alchemical. Professor Dodd might know more. He's studied such things, but I've never cracked it myself. The map's parchment is fragile, its ink faded, but the symbols, they're deliberate, almost like a warning." Before Miss Marple could press further, the library door swung open, and Professor Clarence Dodd strode in, his glasses glinting in the firelight. "Ashford, you promised me access to your archives," he said, his voice booming with self-importance. "If I'm to waste my weekend here, I expect to see something worth my time." Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his hands fidgeted with his notebook, the way his eyes darted to Lord Ashford's desk. "Good morning, Professor," she said pleasantly. "I understand you are an expert in maps. Have you ever encountered one called the Map to Death?" Dodd froze, his expression shifting from irritation to wariness. "I've heard of it," he said cautiously. "A myth, mostly. Blackwood set folly, they called it. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely curiosity," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I find old stories so revealing. Don't you? They tell us so much about the people who believe them." Dodd muttered something about amateur speculation and excused himself, but Miss Marple caught the flush on his cheeks, the slight tremor in his voice. She turned back to Lord Ashford. "A most interesting man, the Professor. He reminds me of a curate we once had in St. Mary Mead, always so eager to seem knowledgeable, yet so quick to change the subject when pressed." Lord Ashford frowned. "You think he sits hiding something?" "I think," Miss Marple said, picking up her knitting at last, "that everyone here is hiding something. The trick is finding out what and why." As Lord Ashford excused himself to attend to his guests, Miss Marple lingered in the library, her needles clicking rhythmically. She thought of the map, its cryptic symbols, its deadly history, a treasure of knowledge. Lord Ashford had said, but knowledge, she knew, could be as dangerous as any blade, especially in the wrong hands. And as she glanced at the portrait of Sir Reginald Blackwood above the fireplace, his stern eyes seeming to follow her, she felt a chill. The map to death was no mere relic, it was a challenge, a puzzle that had already claimed lives. And somewhere in Ashford Hall, someone knew its secrets. Chapter 4. The Gathering Storm. The drawing-room of Ashford Hall was a study in contrasts, opulent yet oppressive, its high ceilings and velvet drapes unable to mask the undercurrent of unease that hung over the gathered guests. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision, her eyes darting from face to face like a bird flitting through branches. The fire roared in the grate, but its warmth did little to thaw the chill of suspicion that had settled over the room. Lord Ashford's announcement about the stolen map to death lingered in the air, and Miss Marple noted how each guest wore their discomfort differently, like ill-fitting masks at a masquerade. Lady Beatrice Worthing stood by the grand piano, her black dress stark against the polished wood, her fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on her fan. "Really, Ashford," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "this talk of stolen maps and curses is tiresome. If you've lost your precious artifact, hire a detective. Why drag us into it?" Lord Ashford, standing near the mantel, adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous habit. Miss Marple observed. "My dear Lady Beatrice," he replied, his tone measured, "I merely thought my guests, with their varied expertise, might shed light on the matter. The map is of historical significance, after all." "Historical nonsense," muttered Professor Clarence Dodd, slouched in an armchair with his notebook open. "The map to death is a legend, nothing more. If its set's been stolen, its set's likely some servant pilfered it for a quick sale." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Dodd. His dismissal was too quick, too rehearsed, like a schoolboy caught with a forbidden book. She made a mental note of it, then turned her attention to Miss Clara Duval, who sat poised on a settee, her silk dress catching the firelight. "Oh, but legends are so romantic, Professor," Clara said, her French accent lilting. "A map that leads to doom, c'est magnifique, non? Romantic drivel." Todd snapped, but his eyes lingered on Clara a moment too long, betraying a flicker of unease. Sir Victor Crane, silent until now, leaned against a bookcase, his expression as unreadable as a closed ledger. "Legends or not," he said, his voice low and precise, "theft is a serious matter. Have you considered, Ashford, that the thief might not be among us, but rather someone who knew of your gathering?" Miss Marple noted the way Sir Victor's words shifted the focus outward, away from the room. A diplomat's trick, she thought, and one she had seen before in a certain village council member who always deflected blame. She glanced at Mr. Allard Blake, who was pacing near the window, his florid face redder than usual. "Thieves, curses, maps, what's it matter?" Blake boomed. "Ashford, you promised me a deal on that northern plot. Let's talk business, not fairy tales." Lord Ashford's smile tightened. "All in good time, Blake. For now, let us enjoy the evening." Miss Marple set her knitting down, folding her hands in her lap. "It is curious, isn't it," she said, her voice soft but carrying, "how a single piece of parchment can stir such strong feelings. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a fuss over a missing recipe book. It caused quite the stir, until we found it in the vicar's study, mislaid by his housekeeper. But a map, that's far more intriguing, don't you think?" The room fell silent, the guests turning to her. Lady Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "A recipe book, Miss Marple? Hardly comparable to a stolen artifact." "Oh, I don't know," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "Both hold secrets, don't they? And secrets have a way of making people behave, oddly." Clara laughed, a musical sound that didn't start quite reach her eyes. "You are a philosopher, Miss Marple. Perhaps you should solve this mystery for us." "I'd set merely an old woman who notices things," Miss Marple said humbly. "For instance, I notice how some of you seem more interested in the map's absence than its history. That set's telling, don't it, you think? Dodd coughed, flipping a page in his notebook. Sir Victor's posture stiffened, and Blake stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. Lady Beatrice's fan snapped shut, and Clara's smile faltered, just for a moment. Miss Marple filed each reaction away, her mind weaving a pattern as intricate as her knitting. Lord Ashford cleared his throat. Perhaps we should adjourn to the terrace. The night air might clear our heads. As the guests began to move, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze falling on a small table where a guest had left a cigarette case. It was silver, engraved with a crest she didn't recognize, a serpent coiled around a quill. She made a mental note to ask Edwin Turner about it later. Young men often knew more than they realized. As she rose, she caught Clara Duval whispering to Sir Victor, their heads close together, their words too low to hear. A lover's tête-à-tête, perhaps, or something more calculated? On the terrace, the air was cool, the stars obscured by clouds. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tighter, her thoughts racing. The guests' reactions to the map's mention had been revealing. Lady Beatrice's disdain masked a keen interest. Dodd's bluster hid nervousness. Clara's charm deflected scrutiny. Sir Victor's calm was too studied, and Blake's impatience felt forced. Each was a thread in the tapestry of this mystery, and Miss Marple knew that pulling one might unravel the whole. As she sipped her tea, served by a silent footman, she overheard Blake muttering to Lord Ashford about land values and opportunities. Nearby, Lady Beatrice was quizzing Dodd about medieval ciphers, her tone sharp with accusation. Clara and Sir Victor stood apart, their conversation now silent, but their glances heavy with meaning. Miss Marple smiled to herself. People, she thought, were so very like her neighbours in St. Mary Mead, full of secrets waiting to be noticed. The storm was gathering, not just in the clouds above, but in the hearts of those around her. The map to death was more than a stolen artifact. It was a catalyst, stirring motives as old as greed and as sharp as fear. And as Miss Marple watched the guests disperse into the shadowed gardens, she knew the next move in this deadly game was not far off. Chapter 5. A Theft in the Night. The clock in Ashford Hall's Grand Hall struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the darkened corridors like a warning. Miss Jane Marple lay awake in her guest room, her knitting tucked neatly on the bedside table, her mind as alert as if it were midday. The house was quiet, but not the peaceful quiet of St. Mary Mead. Here the silence was heavy, laced with the weight of secrets. She had retired early, pleading fatigue, but her true purpose was to listen, to sense the pulse of the house and its occupants. Old houses, she knew, had a way of betraying those who moved within them. A faint creak broke her reverie, a floorboard perhaps, or a door eased open with care. Miss Marple sat up, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and listened. There it was again, a soft shuffle, like footsteps muffled by intent. She slipped on her dressing gown, her movements silent despite her age, and peered into the hallway. The corridor was dim, lit only by the flicker of a single gas lamp, but it was empty, yet the air felt charged, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She was about to return to bed when a sharp cry pierced the silence, followed by the clatter of something heavy falling. Miss Marple moved swiftly, her slippers whispering against the polished floor, and followed the sound to the library. The door was ajar, and inside a scene of chaos greeted her. Lord Ashford stood in his dressing gown, his face pale, staring at an overturned chair and a scattering of papers on the floor. Edwin Turner hovered nearby, clutching a candlestick as if it were a weapon. Miss Marple, Lord Ashford exclaimed, his voice hoarse. "Thank heavens you set her here. That's happened again. Another theft." Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, taking in the open window, the curtains fluttering in the night breeze, and the empty space on Lord Ashford's desk where a small wooden box had sat earlier that day. "What's been taken?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. "A copy of the map to death," Lord Ashford said, running a hand through his dishevelled hair. "Not the original, of course, that sits long gone, but a facsimile I kept for study. It was in that box, locked tight. I heard a noise, came to check, and found this." Miss Marple knelt by the desk, her fingers brushing the floor. A faint smudge of mud caught her eye, barely visible in the candlelight. "Curious," she murmured. "The thief was careless, or perhaps in a hurry." Edwin stepped forward, his voice trembling. "I was in the hall when I heard the cry. I saw no one, but look at this." He held out a crumpled piece of paper, its edges torn. Scrawled in a hasty hand were the words, "The map leads to death. Leave it be, or join the cursed." Miss Marple took the note, her expression serene but her mind racing. The handwriting was uneven, almost deliberately so, as if to disguise the author's identity. "Or warning," she said softly, "or perhaps a distraction. In my village, we once had a series of anonymous letters, quite nasty. They were, but they always revealed more about the writer than the recipient." Lord Ashford's face tightened. "This is no village prank, Miss Marple. Someone in this house is playing a dangerous game." "Indeed," she agreed, folding the note carefully. "But games have rules, Lord Ashford, and players have habits. We shall find them out." The commotion had drawn the other guests, who now gathered at the library door, their faces a mix of curiosity and alarm. Lady Beatrice Worthing, her hair in curlers beneath a silk scarf, clutched her robe tightly. "What now, Ashford?" she demanded. "More of your theatrics?" "No theatrics," Lord Ashford snapped. "The facsimile of the map is gone, stolen from my desk." Professor Dodd pushed past, his glasses askew. "Preposterous. Why steal a copy? It sets worthless without the original." "Worthless to you, perhaps," said Miss Clara Duval, her voice smooth despite the late hour. "But to someone who believes in the curse, even a copy might hold power." Sir Victor Crane, impeccably composed even in his dressing gown, raised an eyebrow. "Or someone wishes to mislead us. A copy could be used to divert attention from the real map set's location." Mr. Harold Blake, bleary-eyed and disgruntled, snorted, "This is absurd. I came here for business, not to chase ghosts and thieves. Ashford, you said better sort this out, or I said leaving at dawn." Miss Marple watched them all, her eyes sharp behind her mild demeanour. Lady Beatrice's indignation seemed too sharp, as if masking fear. Dodd's bluster felt forced, his hands fidgeting with his glasses. Clara's calm was almost too perfect, like a painting too carefully composed. Sir Victor's suggestion was clever, too clever perhaps. And Blake's impatience rang hollow, like a man eager to distance himself from trouble. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the tension, "we might all benefit from a moment sit's calm. Theft, like gossip, thrives in chaos. If we could examine the room together, we might notice something the thief overlooked." The guests exchanged wary glances, but Lord Ashford nodded. "Very well, let's search the library." As they spread out, Miss Marple lingered by the window, her fingers brushing the sill. A faint scratch mark caught her attention, barely visible in the wood, a sign of a tool, perhaps, used to pry it open. She glanced at the guests. Dodd was rifling through papers with undue haste. Clara was inspecting a bookshelf with studied nonchalance, and Sir Victor stood back, watching everyone. Lady Beatrice hovered near the desk, her eyes darting to the overturned chair, while Blake muttered complaints, but stayed close to the door. Miss Marple tucked the observation away, her mind weaving connections. The note, the mud, the scratch mark. They were threads in a pattern, and she was beginning to see its shape. The thief was bold, but not infallible. And as she watched the guests search, their movements betraying their nerves, she knew the map to death was drawing them all into its deadly web. Chapter 6. Shadows of Suspicion. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Ashford Hall, casting a pale light across the breakfast room where the guests had gathered. The air was thick with unease, the events of the previous night's theft hanging over them like a fog. Miss Jane Marple sat at the far end of the table, her knitting tucked in her bag, her eyes moving from one guest to another with the quiet alertness of a cat watching a garden. The clink of china and the murmur of strained conversation did little to mask the tension. It was, Miss Marple thought, rather like a village tea party after a scandal, everyone polite, but no one at ease. Lord Ashford, seated at the head, looked haggard, his coffee untouched. "I sit," informed the staff, "to keep the library sealed until we can investigate further," he said. His voice clipped. "This nonsense must end." "Nonsense!" Lady Beatrice Worthington's voice was sharp as she buttered her toast. "2 thefts in as many weeks, Ashford, and you call it nonsense? Your security is a disgrace." Miss Marple noted the way Lady Beatrice's eyes flicked toward Lord Ashford, not with concern but with something closer to calculation. She made a mental note, then turned her attention to Professor Clarence Dodd, who was scribbling furiously in his notebook, his breakfast plate ignored. "If I may," he said, looking up, "the theft of a facsimile suggests the thief is either desperate or incompetent. The real map is what matters." "Or perhaps," Miss Clara Duval interjected, her smile as polished as her silver spoon, "the thief wishes us to believe the copy is unimportant, a clever ruse, none." Sir Victor Crane, sipping his tea, set his cup down with deliberate care. "A ruse implies intent, Miss Duval. But intent to what end? To scare us, to distract us." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Sir Victor's calm was like a still pond, deceptively smooth, hiding depths. She glanced at Mr. Harold Blake, who was attacking his bacon with unnecessary vigour. "All this talk of maps and ruses," Blake grumbled. "I say it's a prank. Some servant's idea of a joke, and we're all wasting our time." "Oh, I don't know," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a prankster who hid the church collection plate. Everyone laughed, until we found it in the culprit's garden shed, along with a few other stolen trinkets. Small acts often reveal larger truths, don't you think?" The table fell silent, the guests exchanging glances. Clara's smile tightened, Dodd's pen paused, and Blake's fork hovered mid-air. Lady Beatrice's fan snapped open, a sharp click in the quiet. "Are you suggesting one of us is the thief, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone icy. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her eyes wide with innocence. "I merely observe that people's 6 reactions to trouble are so very telling, like my neighbour, Mrs. Price, who always fusses when she sits hiding something." Edwin Turner, who had been hovering near the sideboard, cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, I found something this morning, near the library window." He produced a small brass key, its surface tarnished but intact. It was in the grass, just outside. Miss Marple took the key, turning it over in her hands. It was small, the kind that might fit a drawer or a box, but not the heavy lock of the library safe. "How curious," she murmured. "And you found it where the mud was smudged, I presume?" Edwin nodded, his face earnest. "Exactly. I thought it might be important." Lord Ashford leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "All of us sipstab not one of mine. The library safe uses a different key entirely." "Perhaps it belongs to one of the guests," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. She glanced around the table, noting how Dodd's fingers tightened on his pen, how Clara's gaze lingered on the key, how Sir Victor's expression remained impassive. Blake, however, snorted. "A key, probably dropped by a gardener. You're making mountains out of molehills." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, slipping the key into her pocket. "But molehills can hide tunnels, Mr. Blake." After breakfast, Miss Marple excused herself to explore the grounds, her shawl wrapped tightly against the morning chill. She wandered toward the library window, her eyes scanning the grass where Edwin had found the key. The mud smudge was still there, faint but distinct, and she noticed something else, a faint impression in the soil, like the edge of a shoe too small to belong to a man. She knelt, her fingers brushing the earth, and thought of Clara Duval's delicate heels, Lady Beatrice's sturdy boots. Women, she knew, could be as cunning as men in matters of theft. Returning to the house, she sought out Edwin in the hall. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice low, "have you noticed any of the guests acting unusually since last night?" Edwin hesitated, then leaned closer. "Miss Duval was in the corridor late last night, near the library. She said she was looking for a book, but she seemed flustered. And Professor Dodd, he's been asking about the map sept symbols, almost obsessively." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. Keep your eyes open, one sit you. Young men like you are so good at noticing things." As Edwin hurried off, Miss Marple returned to her room, her thoughts a tangle of clues, the mud, the key, the note, the guests' guarded glances. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still unclear. The map to death was drawing them all into its shadow, and she sensed the thief was closer than anyone realized. She sat by the window, her knitting resumed, and watched the clouds gather over Ashford Hall. Suspicion, she knew, was like a storm, silent until it broke, but inevitable. And as she stitched, she waited for the first crack of thunder. Chapter 7. The Hidden Passage. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Hall, casting long shadows across the oak-panelled walls. Miss Jane Marple moved quietly through the east wing, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs, her knitting bag slung over her arm like a faithful companion. The house was restless, its guests scattered after a tense luncheon where whispered accusations had replaced polite conversation. The theft of the map's facsimile, coupled with the cryptic note, had set everyone on edge, and Miss Marple sensed the mystery was deepening, like a knot tightening in her knitting. She had excused herself to rest, but rest was far from her mind. Her morning exploration of the grounds had confirmed her suspicion that the thief was no outsider. The mud smudge and shoe print suggested someone familiar with the estate's layout. Now, she was drawn to the portrait gallery, a long dim corridor lined with stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her. She had noticed something during breakfast, a faint draught near the gallery's end, where a portrait of Sir Reginald Blackwood hung, his hand resting on the same globe she had seen in the library. Miss Marple paused before the portrait, her fingers brushing the ornate frame. "You knew something, didn't you?" she murmured, half to herself. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a theft by noticing a loose floorboard in the vicarage. Old houses, she knew, loved to hide their secrets in plain sight. She pressed gently on the frame, then along the panelling beneath it. A soft click rewarded her efforts, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage cloaked in darkness. Her heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. She glanced over her shoulder. Nobody was in sight, and slipped into the passage, pulling the panel shut behind her. The air was musty, thick with the scent of damp stone and thyme. A faint light flickered at the far end, and she moved toward it, her steps cautious but sure. The passage sloped downward, its walls lined with rough-hewn stone, and she wondered if Sir Reginald himself had used it to guard his secrets. At the end of the passage, she found a small chamber, barely larger than a pantry. A single lantern hung from a hook, casting a weak glow over a wooden table. On it lay a tattered journal, its pages yellowed and curling. Miss Marple opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The handwriting was spidery, dated 1587 and signed by Sir Reginald Blackwood. One entry caught her attention. "The map is my legacy and my curse. Its symbols guard the truth, but only the worthy may decipher them. Let those who seek it beware, for death follows the unworthy." She closed the journal, her mind racing. The map's symbols were a cipher, as Lord Ashford had said, but this suggested they were more than a guide to treasure. They were a test. Before she could read further, a shadow moved at the chamber's entrance, and she turned to find Miss Clara Duval, her silk scarf slipping from her hair, her eyes wide with surprise. "Miss Marple!" Clara exclaimed, her French accent sharper in her alarm. "What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same, Miss Duval," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her gaze sharp. "This is a curious place for a stroll." "Done set, you think?" Clara's smile was quick, but it lacked its usual polish. I was exploring. Old houses fascinate me. I saw the panel open and followed. I didn't expect to find you here." Miss Marple nodded, unconvinced. "And yet here we are. This journal mentions the map to death. Do you know anything about it?" Clara's eyes flickered to the journal, then back to Miss Marple. "Only what Lord Ashford told us, a cursed relic. None. But I am no scholar. Such things are for Professor Dodd." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, tucking the journal under her arm. "But curiosity can lead us to unexpected places, can sit it, like my neighbour, Miss Hartnell, who once wandered into a barn looking for her cat and found a stolen bicycle instead." Clara laughed, a nervous sound. "You are full of stories, Miss Marple. Shall we return? This place is too damp for my liking." Miss Marple agreed, but as they retraced their steps, she noted the way Clara's hands trembled, the way her eyes darted to the shadows. Someone had been watching her, she was certain, and Clara's presence in the passage was no accident. As they emerged into the portrait gallery, they were met by Edwin Turner, his face flushed with worry. "Miss Marple, Miss Duval," he said, his voice low. "I saw the panel open and feared, well, with all that's happened." "No need for fear, Mr. Turner," Miss Marple said calmly. "But do tell Lord Ashford I found something of interest. And perhaps keep an eye on this passage. It seems to attract curious visitors." As Edwin hurried off, Miss Marple turned to Clara. "You still forgive an old woman sits, caution Miss Duval, but I still advise against wandering alone. Secrets have a way of drawing danger." Clara sits smile returned, but it was strained. "You are too wise, Miss Marple. I shall be more careful." Alone again, Miss Marple returned to her room, the journal safely in her bag. She sat by the window, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts were on the passage and its secrets. The journal confirmed the map's significance, but it also raised questions. Why had Clara followed her? Who else knew of the passage, and what did the worthy decipherer of the map's symbols seek? The shadows of suspicion were lengthening, and Miss Marple felt the weight of unseen eyes. The thief she knew was growing bolder, and the map to death was drawing them all closer to its truth and its danger. Chapter 8. A Dangerous Discovery. The library of Ashford Hall was a sanctuary of silence in the late afternoon, its shelves heavy with the weight of centuries. Miss Jane Marple sat at a carved oak table, a stack of old ledgers before her, her knitting relegated to her bag for the moment. The parchment she had found in the hidden passage lay hidden in her pocket, its cryptic symbols a constant presence in her thoughts. The house was quieter now, the guests scattered, some in the gardens, others in their rooms, but Miss Marple preferred the library's solitude. It was, she thought, like the quiet moments in St. Mary Mead, when the village's secrets seemed to whisper through the air. She had spent the morning poring over Lord Ashford's records, searching for clues about the map to death and its connection to the house. The ledgers, dusty and faded, chronicled the estate's history, but it was a single entry dated 1843 that caught her eye. Written in a spidery hand, it described a tragedy, a fire in the East Wing that claimed the life of a young woman, Margaret Blackwood, a descendant of Sir Reginald Blackwood, the map's creator. The fire was ruled an accident, but a note in the margin, added later, hinted at foul play. Suspected arson, motives unclear. Map mentioned. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the page, her mind turning over the implications. A tragedy tied to the map, buried in the past, yet resonating with the present thefts. She closed the ledger and rose, her eyes scanning the room. The portrait of Sir Reginald Blackwood glared down from above the fireplace, his stern expression unchanged. But Miss Marple noticed something new, a faint crack in the frame, as if it had been recently disturbed. She made a mental note to examine it later, when the house was still. The library door creaked open, and Professor Clarence Dodd entered, his arms laden with books. "Miss Marple," he said, startled, adjusting his glasses. "I didn't expect to find you here. Researching, are we?" "Oh, just indulging an old woman sits curiosity," she replied, her tone mild. "This house has such a rich history, don't you think? I was reading about a fire in 1843. Quite tragic. Margaret Blackwood, I believe." Doddist's face paled, his book slipping slightly in his grasp. "Margaret Blackwood," he repeated, his voice tight. "A minor footnote in the estate's history. Why bring it up?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Footnotes can be so revealing, Professor. Like the little details in my village, small things, like a misplaced letter, often lead to larger truths." Dodd set his books down with a thud, his fingers twitching. "You start fishing, Miss Marple. The fire was an accident, nothing more. And it has no bearing on this nonsense about the map." "Perhaps," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "But the map was mentioned in the records." Curious, isn't it, how it keeps resurfacing, like a ghost that one set stay buried. Before Dodd could respond, Miss Clara Duval glided into the room, her silk dress rustling. "Oh, Miss Marple, always with your mysteries," she said, her laugh light but her eyes wary. "And you, Professor, always buried in books. Have you found anything to solve our little puzzle?" Dodd snorted, turning away. "I'm not here to play detective. I'm studying Ashford Stum's collection, as requested." Clara's smile widened, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers toyed with a pendant at her throat, a nervous habit perhaps. "And you, Miss Marple?" Clara asked. "What have you found in these dusty tomes?" "Only stories," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands. "But stories have a way of connecting, don't they? Like the threads in my knitting, pull one, and the whole pattern shifts." Clara's laugh was a touch too bright, and Dodd's scowl deepened. Miss Marple watched them both, her mind weaving connections, the fire, the map, the hidden passage. She was about to press further when Lord Ashford entered, his face drawn. "Miss Marple, a word, if you please," he said, gesturing toward the corridor. She followed him to a small study, where he closed the door. "I've found something," he said, his voice low. "In my father's papers, there's a letter from Margaret Blackwood, written days before the fire. She claimed someone was after the map to death, someone within the family. She feared for her life." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And the letter, where is it now?" Lord Ashford hesitated, then opened a drawer and produced a yellowed envelope. The letter inside was brittle, its ink faded, but the words were clear. "The map is a curse. They will kill to possess it. I must hide it, or all is lost." "Extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers brushing the paper. "This changes things, Lord Ashford. The map set's theft is no mere act of greed. It's set's tied to a history of betrayal." Lord Ashford nodded, his expression grim. "But who? One of the guests? Or someone else, lurking in the shadows?" Miss Marple tucked the letter into her pocket, beside the parchment from the passage. "That, Lord Ashford, is what we must discover. But we must tread carefully. The past has a way of reaching into the present, and those who seek the map may not hesitate to harm again." As they returned to the library, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of connections. Margaret's letter, the fire, the stolen facsimile, the hidden passage. The map to death was no longer just a relic. It was a key to a tragedy that had never been resolved. And as she glanced at the guests now reassembling for tea, their faces masks of politeness, she knew the danger was closer than ever. Someone in Ashford Hall was following in the footsteps of a murderer, and Miss Marple was determined to find them before the past claimed another victim. Chapter 9. The Midnight Confession. The night was heavy over Ashford Hall, the moon obscured by clouds that seemed to press against the windows. Miss Jane Marple sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles idle, her eyes fixed on the shadowed gardens below. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling, but Miss Marple's mind was far from restful. The letter from Margaret Blackwood, tucked safely in her bag alongside the parchment from the hidden passage, weighed on her thoughts. A tragedy from 1843, a stolen map, a fresh theft, each piece of the puzzle pointed to a truth buried deep yet tantalizingly close. A soft knock at her door startled her, though her expression remained serene. She rose, smoothing her dressing gown, and opened the door to find Miss Clara Duval, her face pale in the dim light of a single candle. Her silk robe was hastily tied, and her usual charm was replaced by a nervous edge. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "may I speak with you? It's urgent." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit down. You look quite shaken." Clara perched on the edge of the seat, her hands twisting the sash of her robe. "I can keep silent any longer," she said, her French accent more pronounced in her agitation. "I know something about the map, the facsimile that was stolen last night." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained gentle. "Go on, Miss Duval. Secrets, like laundry, are best aired in private." Clara took a shaky breath. "I saw someone in the library just before the theft. It was late, and I couldn't sleep, so I went to find a book. I saw Professor Dodd there, near Lord Ashford's desk. He was holding something, a paper, perhaps, and he looked. When he saw me, he hid it and left quickly." Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind cataloguing the details. "Professor Dodd, you say? And this paper, did it resemble the facsimile of the map to death?" "I couldn't see clearly," Clara admitted, her eyes darting to the window. "But it was small, like the one Lord Ashford described. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after the theft, I'm certain he's involved." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's very interesting, Miss Duval. But tell me, why come to me now, at this hour? Surely you could have spoken to Lord Ashford this morning." Clara Stoss, fingers tightened on her sash. I didn't want to cause a scene. And you, Miss Marple, you seem to see things others miss, like that old woman in my village in Provence. Always watching, always knowing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Village life is much the same everywhere, isn't it? But confessions, my dear, are rarely complete. Is there anything else you wish to tell me?" Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering. "No, that's all. I just thought you should know." She rose, her movements hurried. Please, don't tell anyone I came to you. I don't want trouble." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Discretion is a virtue, after all." As Clara slipped out, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her thoughts racing. Clara's confession was revealing, but not in the way the young woman intended. Her nervousness, the late-night visit, the careful omission of details, it reminded Miss Marple of a certain shopgirl in St. He, Mary Mead, who had once confessed to a theft, only to hide her own complicity. Clara's story about Dodd was plausible, but it felt like a half-truth, designed to deflect suspicion. Miss Marple rose and paced the room, her slippers silent on the rug. She considered confronting Dodd but decided against it. A man like him, pompous yet insecure, would only clam up under pressure. Instead, she resolved to watch him closely, and Clara too. The confession had shifted the puzzle, but it also raised new questions. Why had Clara been in the library so late? And why point the finger at Dodd now? The next morning, at breakfast, the atmosphere was electric, with tension. Professor Dodd was quieter than usual, his eyes red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept. Lady Beatrice Worthing, seated across from him, was sharp as ever, her comments laced with venom. "You look dreadful, Professor," she said, slicing her grapefruit. "Up late studying maps, were you?" Doddist's fork clattered against his plate. "I was in my room all night," he snapped. "Unlike some, I don't skulk about in the dark." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the defensiveness in his tone, the way his hands shook slightly. She glanced at Clara, who was smiling at Sir Victor Crane, her composure restored. Sir Victor, as always, was a study in restraint, his responses polite but distant. Harold Blake, meanwhile, was complaining loudly about the circus of the weekend, his face flushed with irritation. Lord Ashford entered, his expression grim. "I've had the staff search the grounds again," he announced. "No sign of the facsimile, but they found this near the library window." He held up a torn piece of fabric, grey and coarse, like that of a servant's uniform. Miss Marple Sixt's eyes narrowed. "Curious," she said softly. "It's Sixt's not unlike the fabric one might find in a gardener Sixt's coat, or perhaps a disguise." Blake snorted. "A disguise? This is getting ridiculous. Next you shall say the ghost of Sir Reginald is stealing maps." "Stranger things have happened," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "In my village we once had a thief who dressed as a postman. That's remarkable what a bit of cloth can hide." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Miss Marple felt the weight of their secrets pressing closer. Clara's confession had pointed to Dodd, but it also cast a shadow on her own motives. The torn fabric, the hidden passage, Margaret Blackwood's letter, all were threads in a tapestry that was growing darker by the hour. As she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly, Miss Marple knew the truth was near, but so was the danger. Chapter 10. The trap is set. The late afternoon light cast a golden sheen over Ashford Hall, but the warmth did little to ease the chill of suspicion that had settled among its guests. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her eyes moving from one guest to another with the quiet precision of a watchmaker. The torn fabric, Clara's midnight confession, and the hidden passage had woven a complex pattern in her mind, and she sensed the time had come to tug at a thread. Mary Mead, she had once exposed a pilferer by leaving a tempting jar of sweets in plain view. Now she would need a similar bait for a far more dangerous quarry. Lord Ashford stood by the fireplace, his face etched with worry. "This cannot continue," he said, addressing the gathered guests. "Two thefts, cryptic notes, hidden passages, it's intolerable. I am tempted to call the police, despite the risk of scandal." Lady Beatrice Worthing, fanning herself with sharp, deliberate motions, scoffed. "Police? They sit'll trample through your precious collection and find nothing. This is an inside job, Ashford, and you know it." Professor Clarence Dodd, slumped in an armchair, adjusted his glasses. "An inside job implies one of us," he said, his voice tight. "I resent the accusation. I been nothing but cooperative." Miss Clara Duval, perched on a settee, smiled sweetly. "Cooperative, Professor? You been poking through Lord Ashford's papers like a man possessed. Perhaps you too curious about this map." Dodd Starr's face reddened, but before he could retort, Sir Victor Crane spoke, his tone cool and measured. "Accusations 1 sit. Help. We need evidence, not speculation." Mr. Harold Blake, pacing by the window, snorted. "Evidence? This whole weekend is a farce. I'm leaving tomorrow. Ashford, map or no map." Miss Marple set her knitting down, her voice soft but carrying. "Oh, I don't know, Mr. Blake. Leaving now might be hasty. In my village, we once had a man who left a card game early. Everyone assumed he was bored, but later we found he'd pocketed the winnings. Timing, you see, can be so revealing." The room fell silent, the guests exchanging wary glances. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. but her mind was sharp, calculating. Clara's accusation against Dodd, the torn fabric, the letter from Margaret Blackwood, all pointed to a thief among them, someone bold yet desperate. She decided it was time to set a trap. "Lord Ashford," she said, rising, "might I suggest a small experiment? You mentioned having another copy of the map's symbols, a partial sketch, I believe. Why not place it somewhere conspicuous, say, in the library, and see who takes an interest? People, like moths, are drawn to light, even when it burns." Lord Ashford Sext's eyes widened, but he nodded. "A clever idea, Miss Marple. I have a sketch in my study. I'll place it on the library desk tonight, under the guise of cataloguing my collection." Lady Beatrice Sipst's fan snapped shut. "A trap? Really, Ashford, this is becoming theatrical." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "a bit of theatre is just what sets needed to reveal the truth. Like the time our village drama club staged a play and the lead actor Set's nerves gave away his secret engagement." Clara laughed, but her eyes were guarded. "You are full of surprises, Miss Marple. Very well. Let's see who takes the bait." As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts racing. The trap was simple but effective. The sketch would tempt the thief to act, revealing their hand. But she knew the risk. Someone desperate enough to steal twice might not hesitate to silence a witness. She resolved to stay vigilant, her senses attuned to every creak and whisper in the house. That evening after dinner, Lord Ashford made a show of placing the sketch, a small sheet of paper covered in cryptic symbols, on the library desk, muttering about organizing his notes. The guests watched, some with feigned disinterest, others with barely concealed curiosity. Miss Marple noted Dodd's lingering glance, Clara's fleeting smile, Sir Victor's impassive stare, and Blake's impatient huff. Lady Beatrice, however, excused herself early, claiming a headache. Miss Marple retired to her room but did not sleep. Instead, she positioned her chair by the door, her knitting in her lap, and waited. The house grew quiet, the clock ticking toward midnight. Then, a faint creak, the same floorboard she had heard before. She slipped into the corridor, her slippers silent, and made her way to the library, keeping to the shadows. Through the cracked door, she saw a figure by the desk, illuminated by a single candle. The figure was slight, cloaked in a dark shawl, and their hands moved quickly, snatching the sketch. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she held back, watching as the figure turned toward the hidden passage's entrance. Before they could disappear, she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Good evening. I see you found Lord Ashford's sketch." The figure froze, the shawl slipping to reveal Clara Duval Sip's pale face. "Miss Marple," she gasped, clutching the paper. I was only looking. I thought it might help solve the mystery." Miss Marple Sip's eyes narrowed, though her smile remained gentle. "Curiosity is a powerful thing, Miss Duval, but taking what isn't yours that sits something else entirely. Shall we discuss this with Lord Ashford?" Clara Sip's composure cracked, her voice trembling. "Please, it's not what you think. I only wanted to protect someone." "Protect someone?" Miss Marple asked, her tone soft but probing. "Or perhaps protect yourself?" Before Clara could answer, a loud crash echoed from the passage, followed by a muffled curse. Miss Marple's senses sharpened. There was another player in this game, and the trap had sprung, but not quite as she had planned. The stakes were rising, and the map to death was drawing them all closer to its deadly truth. Chapter 11. The Map Set's True Purpose. The library of Ashford Hall was a cavern of shadows, the single candle on the desk casting a flickering glow over Miss Jane Marple and Miss Clara Duval. Clara's face was pale, her hands clutching the stolen sketch of the map to death, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. The crash from the hidden passage still echoed in Miss Marple's ears, a reminder that they were not alone in this deadly game. She stood calmly, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her expression serene, but her mind racing like the wind through St. Mary Mead's hedgerows. "Miss Duval," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "You were about to explain why you took the sketch. Protecting someone, you said. I find that people often protect others to shield themselves. In my village, a young man once hid a stolen watch to protect his sister, only to be caught with it himself." Clara's lips trembled, but before she could respond, the panel to the hidden passage creaked open, and Professor Clarence Dodd stumbled out, his glasses askew, a smear of dust on his cheek. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, his voice hoarse. "I was checking the passage for clues. I heard voices and you tripped over something, I presume," Miss Marple interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "How convenient that you both found yourselves here at the same hour." Dodstit's face reddened, and he pointed at Clara. "She's the one with the sketch. I told you, Miss Marple. She's not to be trusted." Clara Sit's eyes flashed. "Don't play innocent, Professor. You were in this passage last night, and I saw you with a paper just like this one." Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone soothing but commanding. "Enough, both of you. Accusations are like tangled wool, useless until unraveled. Miss Duval, the sketch, if you please." Clara hesitated, then handed the paper to Miss Marple, who examined it under the candlelight. The symbols were identical to those on the parchment from the passage, but there was something else, a faint watermark, barely visible, depicting a raven clutching a scroll, the Ashford crest. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was no mere sketch, but a clue to something deeper. At that moment, Lord Ashford burst into the library, followed by Edwin Turner, both in dressing gowns. "What's going on here?" Lord Ashford demanded, his eyes darting from Clara to Dodd. "Miss Marple, have you caught the thief?" "Not quite," Miss Marple replied, folding the sketch carefully. "But I believe we stir closer to understanding the map to death set's true purpose. Lord Ashford, this watermark, does it signify anything particular in your family set's history?" Lord Ashford took the sketch, his brow furrowing. "The raven and scroll. It's our crest, yes, but it's also tied to a legend. My great-grandfather wrote of a hidden vault in Ashford Hall, built by Sir Reginald Blackwood to protect his most valuable secrets. The map, he believed, was the key to finding it. Not a treasure of gold, but of documents that could ruin powerful families." Miss Marple, Sixth's eyes gleamed. "Documents," she murmured. "How very interesting. In St. Mary Mead, we once had a scandal over a lost diary that exposed a mere 6 indiscretions. Secrets on paper can be more dangerous than any jewel." Dodd snorted, though his hands shook. "A vault? Preposterous. If such a thing existed, I should have found it in my research." "Would you, Professor?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. "You seem awfully keen on the map set's symbols. Perhaps you know more than you let on." Clara stepped forward, her voice urgent. "He does! I saw him copying symbols from a book in the library yesterday, muttering about a Seki to power." "Sit." Dodd Stet's face contorted. Lies! I was studying medieval ciphers, nothing more. Lord Ashford raised a hand. Enough. Miss Marple, what do you make of this? She paused, her mind weaving the threads together. Margaret Blackwood's letter, the hidden passage, the watermark, Clara's confession, Dodd's defensiveness. The map to death, she said slowly, is not a map to a place, but to a truth. It leads to this vault, which holds secrets someone is desperate to uncover or to keep hidden. The thefts, the notes, the passage, all are meant to confuse us, to keep us from the real prize. Edwin, who had been silent, spoke up. But who? One of the guests? Or someone else? Miss Marple Sipt's gaze swept the room, lingering on Clara Sipt's nervous fingers, Dodd Sipt's flushed face, Lord Ashford Sipt's tense posture. That, Mr. Turner, is what we must discover. But I suspect the thief is closer than we think, and more desperate than we know. Lord Ashford nodded grimly. I still have the staff search for signs of this vault. But we must be cautious. If these documents are as dangerous as my great-grandfather claimed, the thief ones must hesitate to protect their secret. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts racing. The map's true purpose was clear now, a key to a vault that held secrets worth killing for. Clara's confession and Dodd's presence in the passage suggested they were entangled. But how? And what of the other guests? Lady Beatrice's sharp ambition, Sir Victor's cool reserve, Blake's impatience. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple sensed the picture was nearly complete. She slipped the sketch into her pocket, beside Margaret's letter, and made her way to her room, her senses alert. The trap had revealed more than she'd expected, but it had also raised the stakes. Someone in Ashford Hall was playing a deadly game, and the map to death was leading them all toward a reckoning. Chapter 12. The Final Confrontation. The drawing-room of Ashford Hall was a stage set for revelation, its heavy drapes drawn against the evening gloom, the fire casting flickering shadows across the faces of the assembled guests. Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her knitting bag at her feet, her posture as unassuming as ever, yet her presence commanded the room. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of 2 thefts, a cryptic note, a hidden passage, and a vault of secrets pressing down on everyone. Lord Ashford stood by her side, his face taut, while the guests, Lady Beatrice Worthing, Professor Clarence Dodd, Miss Clara Duval, Sir Victor Crane, and Mr. Harold Blake, sat in a tense semicircle, their eyes darting with suspicion. Miss Marple folded her hands, her voice calm but carrying. "Thank you all for gathering," she began. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a theft at the church bazaar. Nothing grand, just a silver teapot. But it taught me that thieves, like gossips, leave traces of their intent. Tonight, I believe we can uncover the truth about the map to death." Lady Beatrice Decht's fan snapped open. "This is absurd, Miss Marple. You no detective. Why should we listen to you?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling, "I notice things, like the way you, Lady Beatrice, clutch your fan when the map is mentioned, or how Professor Dodd-Stee's notes are filled with ciphers he claims not to understand." Dodd sputtered, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Preposterous. My research is purely academic." Clara Duval leaned forward, her smile strained. "Miss Marple, surely you don't suspect us all? I be nothing but honest." "Honest?" Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. Your midnight confession about Professor Dodd was most revealing, Miss Duval, but it left out certain details, like why you were in the library yourself, taking the sketch. Clara Sitt's face paled, and Sir Victor Crane Sitt's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "Accusations without proof are dangerous." "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple said, "which is why I've gathered proof." She reached into her pocket and produced the parchment from the hidden passage, the sketch from the library, and Margaret Blackwood's letter. These tell a story, not of treasure, but of secrets. The map to death leads to a vault in this house, filled with documents that could ruin reputations. Someone here knows this, and has been desperate to find it. Mr. Blake snorted, crossing his arms. "This is a waste of time. I am here for business, not your fairy tales." Miss Marple Sitt's gaze settled on him. "Business, Mr. Blake? Or perhaps an interest in the land around Ashford Hall, which might hide the vault Sitt's entrance. Your impatience is rather like that of a young man in my village who rushed to sell a plot, only to be caught hiding stolen deeds." Blake Sept's face reddened, but before he could retort, Lord Ashford stepped forward. "Miss Marple, please name the thief." She nodded, her expression serene. "The thief is clever, leaving clues to mislead us. The mud by the window, the torn fabric, the note, but they made mistakes. The key found by Mr. Turner belonged to a drawer in the library, where the facsimile was kept. The passage was used to hide a tracing of the map's symbols, and Margaret Blackwood's letter warned of a family betrayal. These point to someone with knowledge of the house, its history, and its secrets." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "Professor Dodd, your obsession with the map's ciphers suggests more than academic interest. Miss Duval, your confession was a clever attempt to shift blame. But the real clue was the watermark on the sketch, the Ashford crest, known only to someone intimately tied to this family." Lord Ashford frowned. "But none of these guests are family." "None?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft. "I wonder, Lord Ashford, if you considered your staff. Edwin Turner, for instance, has been remarkably helpful, finding keys, exploring passages, always nearby when trouble strikes." Edwin, standing by the door, froze.
"Me?"
"Miss Marple, I said done nothing but help." "Indeed," she said, her tone unwavering. "But in St. Mary Mead we had a lad who was always first to report a theft because he was the thief. Edwin, your mother was a Blackwood, wasn't she? A distant cousin, perhaps, but close enough to know of the vault and its secrets." The room erupted in gasps. Edwin Sipp's face drained of colour, his hands trembling. That Sips nonsense. I Sips, just a secretary." Miss Marple held up the letter. "Margaret Blackwood wrote of a family member after the map. You knew the passage, the desk, the crest. You stole the facsimile to find the vault, hoping to uncover documents that could secure your future." Edwin lunged toward the door, but Sir Victor stepped forward, blocking his path. "Not so fast, Turner," he said, his voice cold. But then, a sharp laugh cut through the tension. Clara Duval, her eyes blazing. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're clever, but you've missed the mark. Edwin's not the mastermind. He's my pawn." She pulled a small knife from her sleeve, her charm replaced by a chilling resolve. "I used him to get the sketch, to find the vault. Those documents will ruin my family's enemies, and I won't let you stop me." The guests froze, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. Clara's betrayal, was a twist, but not entirely unexpected. The map to death had drawn out the truth, and now the game was at its deadliest. Chapter 13. The Twist of Fate. The drawing-room of Ashford Hall was frozen in a tableau of shock, the fire's glow casting harsh shadows across the guests' faces. Miss Clara Duval stood with a small knife gleaming in her hand, her once charming smile replaced by a steely glint of determination. Edwin Turner, cornered by Sir Victor Crane, looked like a trapped animal, his eyes darting between Clara and Miss Jane Marple, who stood calmly by the fireplace, her hands folded, her expression as serene as if she were discussing the weather in St. Mary Mead. The air crackled with tension, the map to death's deadly legacy laid bare. "Miss Duval," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but cutting through the silence, "you've played a bold hand, admitting to using Mr. Turner. But in my experience, those who confess so dramatically often have more to hide. Like my neighbour, Mrs. Price, who once admitted to borrowing sugar to cover up a far greater theft." Clairvauxit's grip on the knife tightened, her eyes narrowing. "You sit, clever Miss Marple, but you sit meddling in things you don't understand. The vault sits documents will destroy my family sits rivals, old debts, old scandals. I one sits let you stop me." Lord Ashford stepped forward, his face pale. "Clara, this is madness. Put the knife down, and we sit'll talk." "Talk?" Clara laughed. A brittle sound. "You've been blind, Ashford, locked in your dusty study while the world moves on." Edwin was easy to manipulate, a Blackwood by blood, desperate for a legacy. He stole the facsimile for me, thinking he sit find the vault and claim his birthright. Edwin Sip's voice broke, his hands raised. "I didn't know Miss Marple. She promised me wealth, a place in the family. I only took the sketch to prove myself." Miss Marple's Sip's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. "Oh, Mr. Turner, you remind me of a young lad in my village who thought he could outsmart a card sharp. Good intentions don't excuse bad choices, but I wonder, Miss Duval, if you stick to the card sharp or merely another player." The guests gasped, and Clara's smile faltered. "What are you implying?" she demanded. Miss Marple reached into her pocket, producing the parchment from the hidden passage, Margaret Blackwood's letter, and the sketch with the Ashford crest. "These clues," she said, "tell a story of greed, but also of misdirection. The mud by the window, the torn fabric, the note, they were too convenient, too staged. And your confession, Miss Duval, is a touch too theatrical. In St. Mary Mead, we had a girl who confessed to stealing a brooch to protect her lover. I suspect you're protecting someone, or being used by them. Redmond, Miss at best a few." Sir Victor Crane, who had been silent, stepped forward, his face a mask of calm. "Miss Marple, you set her spinning tales. Class its motives are clear. Let's end this, and call the authorities." Miss Marple's gaze settled on him, her voice soft but piercing. "Sir Victor, you've been remarkably quiet throughout this affair. A diplomat's restraint, perhaps? Or the caution of a man who knows more than he admits? The watermark on the sketch, the Ashford crest, was known only to family and close associates. Yet you suggested the thief might be an outsider, deflecting suspicion. Curious, don't you think?" The room stilled, the guest sat, eyes turning to Sir Victor. His composure wavered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "I said no connection to the crest," he said, his voice steady but strained. "You stir, grasping at straws." "Am I?" Miss Marple said, holding up Margaret's letter. This letter mentions a family betrayal, but it also names a trusted confidant, Sir Reginald Blackwood's advisor, a man whose descendants served the Ashfords. Your grandfather, Sir Victor, was such a man, wasn't he? A diplomat, like you, with access to the family's secrets. Lady Beatrice Sistvan fell to her lap, her voice sharp. What are you saying, Miss Marple? That Sir Victor is behind this? Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving Sir Victor. The map to death leads to a vault of documents, secrets that could ruin families, including yours, Sir Victor. You orchestrated the thefts, using Clara to manipulate Edwin, planting clues to confuse us. The mud, the fabric, the note, all you're doing to make the theft seem amateurish. But you knew the vault's location, didn't you? And you needed the map to unlock it. Sir Victor Sept's face hardened, his hands slipping into his pocket. You Sept's a foolish old woman, he said, producing a small pistol, and you Sept overplayed your hand. The guests gasped, but Miss Marple remained unfazed, her voice calm. Oh, I don't think so. In my village, we once had a man who threatened the vicar with a knife over a debt. He forgot that truth is a sharper weapon. You see, Sir Victor, I found a letter in the passage, your grandfather's, confirming the vault's location beneath the east wing. You planned to retrieve the documents and destroy them, protecting your family's name. Lord Ashford-Sit's face darkened. Crane, is this true? Sir Victor's jaw tightened, but before he could act, Edwin lunged, knocking the pistol from his hand. Clara screamed, dropping her knife, and Professor Dodd tackled Sir Victor to the ground. In the chaos, Miss Marple stepped back, her expression serene. The trap had worked, not as she'd planned, but better, revealing the mastermind behind the thefts. As Sir Victor was restrained, Miss Marple spoke softly. The map to death was never about treasure, but about power to destroy or protect. Sir Victor sought to bury his family Sept's shame, but in doing so, he unearthed his own. The guests stared, stunned, as Lord Ashford called for the staff to secure Sir Victor. Clara, trembling, confessed her role as his unwitting accomplice, manipulated by promises of wealth. Edwin, shaken but relieved, vowed to make amends. Miss Marple watched, her knitting resumed, her heart light with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. Chapter 14. The Return to St. Mary Mead. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Ashford Hall, bathing the estate in a gentle light that softened its stern stone facade. Miss Jane Marple stood by the window of her guest room, her knitting packed neatly in her bag, her gaze lingering on the gardens below. The events of the previous night, the dramatic confrontation, Sir Victor Crane's unmasking as the mastermind, and Clara Duval's tearful confession had left the house subdued, its guests preparing to depart with a mixture of relief and unease. For Miss Marple, however, there was a quiet satisfaction, like the feeling of completing a particularly intricate piece of needlework. Lord Ashford had insisted on a private breakfast with her in his study, a small room cluttered with maps and manuscripts. He poured her tea with a hand that still trembled slightly, the weight of the ordeal evident in his tired eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, setting the teapot down, "I cannot thank you enough. You've saved my family's name and uncovered a truth I'd rather not have known." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. "Truth, Lord Ashford, is like a garden weed, unpleasant but persistent. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a scandal over a missing charity fund. It was uncomfortable to unearth, but necessary. Your map to death was much the same. Lord Ashford leaned back, his face thoughtful. Sir Victor, I never suspected him. His grandfather served my family loyally, or so I thought. To think he orchestrated the thefts to destroy those documents, letters proving his family SIP's involvement in a political scandal centuries ago. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. People will go to great lengths to protect their legacy. Lord Ashford. Sir Victor used Miss Duval's ambition and poor Mr. Turner's longing for belonging to weave a web of deception. But webs, you know, are fragile things when one knows where to look. Lord Ashford managed a faint smile. You saw where to look, Miss Marple. The hidden passage, the watermark, Margaret Blackwood Sitt's letter. How did you piece it together? Oh, it's merely a matter of noticing, she said, her voice soft. People are so very like my neighbours in St. Mary Mead. Lady Beatrice's ambition reminded me of our mayor's wife, always scheming for status. Professor Dodd's bluster was like our curate, hiding his doubts behind big words. Miss Duval's charm was like a shopgirl who smiled to cover her debts. And Sir Victor, well, he was like a certain solicitor who thought he could outsmart everyone until he didn't. Lord Ashford chuckled, though it was a weary sound. And Edwin, will he face charges? Miss Marple Sixth's expression softened. Mr. Turner was a pawn, not a player. A stern talking to, and a chance to make amends will do him more good than a courtroom. He sits young, after all, and youth is often misled by promises of grandeur. As they finished their tea, Lord Ashford handed her a small parcel. A token of my gratitude, he said. A book from my collection, on medieval maps, but with no curses attached, I promise. Miss Marple smiled, tucking the parcel into her bag. You set very kind, Lord Ashford, but the real reward is seeing a puzzle solved. Darned, set you think. By midday, Miss Marple was on a train, back to St. Mary Mead, the countryside rolling past in a familiar blur of green and gold. She opened the book Lord Ashford had given her, but her thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the case, the mud by the window, the torn fabric, the cryptic note, the hidden passage. Each clue had been a thread, and Sir Victor's betrayal had been the knot that tied them together. Clara, now remorseful, had promised to cooperate with the authorities, while Lady Beatrice, Professor Dodd, and Mr. Blake had departed with muttered apologies, their own secrets safe, for now. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where life would return to its quiet rhythm, tea with Mrs. Price, gossip at the post office, the vicar's sermons, yet she knew that mysteries, like weeds, would always find their way back. The map to death had been a dangerous puzzle, but it had reminded her of a simple truth. Human nature, with all its flaws and foibles, was the key to every riddle. As the train neared her village, she smiled to herself, content. The world beyond St. Mary Mead was vast and tangled, but her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom could unravel any thread, no matter how knotted. And in that, she found a peace as warm as the sun now breaking through the clouds. A mystery solved, but more await. And so, dear listeners, Miss Marple returns to the cosy calm of St. Mary Mead, leaving Ashford Hall's secrets behind, but not without teaching us that no puzzle is too tangled for a keen mind. What did you think of this thrilling tale? Where are you unraveling mysteries from today? Karachi, London, or a quiet village of your own? Drop your location in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more of Miss Marple's adventures. Don't miss the next clue. Join the chase and let's solve the next mystery together.